Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heidi. I'm from National Flood Services, and my partner presenting today is Sandra Emerson, also from National Flood Services. In our session today, we're going to concentrate really on the flood insurance policy and understanding the coverages within that policy, and we're going to talk about some coverage limitations in that policy as well. I do have just a couple of housekeeping things to talk about before we launch our poll. First is because of the size of the people who registered and that are joining us today, I have muted your phone lines just to keep our lines kind of quiet so that everyone can hear. If you have a question or you have a comment, go ahead and please enter that question or comment on the chat line. We are monitoring the chat line at all times. We'll answer the questions either online. Sometimes we do it online. Sometimes we do it live. Sometimes you might have a question where we need to do just a little bit of research. If that does happen, we will send a follow-up email. We'll include everybody so that they can know the answer to that question as well. Sometimes you ask some pretty in-depth questions. Our session today is going to be for educational purposes only. I'm not going to be able to assign any continuing education credits for the completion of this particular session. Kind of as our icebreaker, kind of to help us get to know you, my partner Sandra is going to go ahead and launch a poll question. Sandy, can you launch and read our poll?
I can. So the first question is, have you read any of the 3 standard flood insurance policy forms?
We have a lot of people who are answering.
We are.
And I'm seeing some surprising results.
Me too.
Since we have kind of a large number, I'm going to give it just a little bit of time before we go ahead and finish that up. David typed his answer in the chat question, which is also fine. David said no. Okay, Sandy, go ahead and launch our results.
Let's see here. There we go.
Our results say that 56% have not read the flood insurance policy, 44% have. I expected it to be higher in the no section than anything. So good for you, everyone who has read the flood insurance policy. The flood insurance policy, for those who have read it, you can certainly commiserate, is a complicated form on what's covered, what's not covered. So we're going to kind of hopefully help narrow that down today. I'm also going to have some resources to help you with that particular process as well. So in our session today, we're really going to cover those 3 policy forms that are under the standard flood insurance policy. You're going to see that a lot of them are the same. We're going to talk in general purposes, very few differences between those particular forms. So we're going to look at coverages A through D. Yes, there are 4 different types of coverages in that policy. We're going to talk about our special limits. We'll talk about some of the items that are not covered in that flood insurance policy. Also, if we're talking about coverages, we certainly have to indicate when are we going to be actual cash value versus replacement cost. And finally, I have a couple of documents that I strongly suggest, and we're going to talk about those documents as well. With that, let's go ahead and dive in. There is one standard flood insurance policy in the National Flood Insurance Program, and there are 3 forms that really make up that one standard flood insurance policy. The dwelling form is really a form that's used to cover single-family dwellings, anything up to a 4-family dwelling. This is a structure, this is a resident, this is someone that lives really as their domicile. That's what that form covers. The general property is going to cover anything that still might be residential. It might have more than 5 units. So we're talking about apartment buildings. We could be talking about hotels, assisted living facilities. However, the general property form is also going to be used for non-residential structures. This could be a storage facility. It could be a detached shed or a garage. It could also be a commercial property, and that's what that general property form covers. The last one is often referred to, we call it the RCBAP. The NFIP loves its acronyms, but it really stands for the Residential Condominium Building Association Policy. This is going to be the Condominium Association's master policy. While, again, there are 3 different forms that make up our coverages, most of the coverages are really going to be the same. You will almost very few times hear us make really a distinction between those particular policies, only slight difference. So if you've read one of those flood insurance policies, you're going to have a really good background as to what may or may not be covered in the other policies, because they kind of work like that in the flood program. As we looked at in our beginning slides, there really are 4 different coverages then that make up that policy. The first is coverage A. Coverage A is really dedicated to your building property. This is going to be things like your insured building, the foundation, could also cover built-in dishwashers, built-in microwave ovens. It could be carpet that's permanently installed over unfinished flooring. Here's where we're going to see our central air conditioners, elevator equipment, walk-in freezers, garbage disposal units, hot water heaters. As a general rule, how I look at this to remember that is coverage A, that building coverage, is the building and the things that really are part of that structure. If I have to get out my toolkit to remove something, if the floodwaters are imminent, then that's going to be part of your building coverage. Refrigerators are going to fall under your building coverage as well. We're going to talk about freezers when we get to our contents coverage. There's also a section in your building property. We're going to talk about some of these. Debris removal is taken from your building coverage, as well as a detached garage. A detached garage, you can apply up to 10% of the building coverage to ensure a detached garage with some qualifications. And those qualifications are that garage has to be used for a garage, meaning it has to have an entrance that a vehicle can be pulled in, and it can't be used for anything other than parking or storage. So let's say that there was an apartment building. Then the policyholder could not apply 10% of that building coverage for the detached garage because it's used for something other than parking and storage. Also, that 10% is not an additional amount of that building coverage. It is reduced from that building coverage. So if you have $250,000 in building coverage, you're not going to be able to apply another 10% on top of that. Once you've reached those program maximums, that's really all that's going to be allowed in the flood program. Again, detached garage. If it's used for any of the other purposes, the policyholder may want to insure it with a separate policy. Coverage B is going to be our personal property coverage. This is our contents coverage. These are the policyholder's personal belongings, and it's going to include clothing, furniture, electronic equipment, blinds, curtains, any portable microwave ovens, portable dishwashers, any carpets that aren't included in the building coverage. So I have an area rug here in my office. That's going to come out of my contents coverage. Clothes washers and dryers fall under your contents coverage, as well as food freezers and the food in them. So your refrigerators are falling under building coverage. Your food freezers, the food in them, falls under your contents coverage. We're going to talk about replacement cost a little bit later. Just note that if you have an item that's coming out of coverage B, your personal property coverage, those contents are always going to be settled as actual cash value. It doesn't matter which of the three policy forms that you're looking at, they will always be actual cash value. Pamela is asking about coverage for generators. Sandy, I'm going to go ahead and let you kind of talk and research about that. Pamela, is that generator connected or part of the structure, or is it in its own building? And while we're kind of working on that one, Linda, curtains does include mini blinds. Curtains, if they can be easily removed, contents coverage. If it's a blind that is kind of connected to your windowsills, it's kind of part of the structure, building coverage. Okay, so Sandy's going to do a little research on that. It's connected and it's outside for Pamela.
Yeah, I'm taking a look.
Okay. While we're working on that, see, Pamela's kind of a regular in our sessions, and so she sometimes has the most interesting questions. So while we're kind of looking at that, let's talk about special limits. Your policy has a section that's called special limits. It might be something that you might want to flag through your policy and look for that particular section. This section includes some of those very special things like artwork, photographs, collectibles, memorabilia. Maybe you have a baseball card collection. That would be included in this. Rare books, autographed items, jewelry, watches, precious or semi-precious stones, furs, paintings, personal property that's used in any business. Special limits on these types of items, meaning that that policy will pay up to $2,500, and that is it. As a rule, the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't pay for the emotional value of an item or a collectible. They don't pay for pretty, they pay for functional. So if you have those high-ticket items that are in this section, the policy in flood insurance is only going to pay up to $2,500, and that's for the entire thing. It's not for each particular group. So if I had 2 furs, I had a diamond necklace, and I had a couple of Monet paintings, the flood insurance policy will only pay up to $2,500, and that is all. So that might be an area that your insured might want to talk to them about, scheduling or getting a different policy for those particular items. For that entire group, the NFIP is going to pay up to $2,500. The flood policy does have an entire list, and it includes, artworks, collectibles. Let's say that Kevin had an antique oak table. The NFIP is going to pay for an oak table that is functional. The NFIP is not going to pay antique value. The NFIP will also not pay emotional value for those particular items. So that's another section of that flood policy where just a little bit extra eyes on it really might be a good idea. So as we're kind of taking a break, we'll answer some questions. But first, Sandy, would you go ahead and launch our second poll?
I will. There we go. And I may have to get back to Pamela on the generator. I can't seem to put my hands on anything that gives me specifics.
A lot of times in the flood policy, each particular structure is different, and so we kind of have to refer to the claims department just to make sure that we get the right answer. So we're going to look that up. So true or false? Joe insured will recover replacement cost for his antique oak desk. And I'm seeing that a lot of people did not go out for a popcorn break. They were paying attention. Sandy, if you'll go ahead and publish our results. "94% said false. Correct. The NFIP will not pay antique. They're going to pay functional. Also, NFIP not going to pay for any kind of attachment or emotional value for those particular items. So, Sandy, except for Pamela's question, which we're going to research, what else do we got going in our chat line?
Well, Kevin had a question, but I'm not sure where, because I was doing some research. I'm not sure where this came in, but he had a question that said that is for each category or group as a total question mark. I'm not sure what you were talking about.
That was when we were talking about our special limits. So that is for the entire group, everything on that list, not for each particular grouping. So furs wouldn't get $2,500, artwork wouldn't get $2,500, the whole thing, everything that would appear on that list, $2,500.
And then Gordon has a question, short-term rentals, would that have to be a commercial policy? And did I miss that secondary or rentals are at ACV? And how would ACV be settled on a claim?
We're going to talk about ACV versus RCV in just a little moment, so we're going to hold that particular question. And if we're talking about a short-term rental, Sandy, is that going to be under a commercial policy?
That is going to be on your general property form, correct.
And we happen to have Bob Butler, who works on our claims department, who is on our line. Thank you, Bob, for answering that. So let me read you his answer. Bob is the guru of everything claims. Everything you've ever wanted to know about claims, Bob is going to know the answer. The standard flood insurance policy does not cover other equipment like generators, air compressors, and substation transformers owned by the policyholder that may service the insured building unless the equipment is hardwired and in an insured building, as defined in the standard flood insurance policy, or in a building physically attached to a covered structure by means of a qualifying addition or extension. Generators stored in a building at the described location are personal property. Generators and other such equipment in a basement are not covered. So again, as I kind of said, when working with claims specifically, a lot of times it's kind of a one-on-one basis. And so sometimes we can't necessarily, in our department, say a general blanket statement, yes, all the time those are covered, all the times those are not covered. It's going to be depend on how is it connected, where its location. And so we're going to get as many of those specific answers as possible. Thank you, Bob, for helping us out on that. And we're going to move forward and talk about coverage C.
Hold on one second real quick,
Okay.
Heidi. One more question from Catherine. She wanted to know if the $2,500 paid for valuables, does that reduce the contents by $2,500? And yes, Catherine, it would. It would still be a part of the contents coverage. It's not separate.
Correct. So moving on to coverage C, other coverages. So coverage A, building coverage. Coverage B, contents coverage. Coverage C has some other coverages that are going to be included. The first is debris removal. The policyholder can pay up to the policy limits in that building coverage to pay the expense to remove either non-owned debris from the insured's property or owned debris from another insured's property. So let's say that Chad's living room furniture ended up in my kitchen. I can use up to my $250,000 for my single-family dwelling minus deductibles to defray the cost of removing Chad's furniture from my kitchen. Or let's say that my kitchen equipment ended up in Bruce's bedroom. Again, I can use up to $250,000 minus my deductible to remove that debris. Now, if I'm using that amount, that doesn't mean that I'm going to get an additional $250,000 in building coverage. Once you've reached the program maximums, coverage stops. And in debris removal, your deductible does count for that. Next is loss avoidance measures. So the policy will pay up to $1,000 to help defray the cost of keeping that structure safe from flooding. This is going to be things like sandbags, the sand or the fill for the sandbags, temporary levees, pumps, plastic sheeting, or lumber. Also can pay minimum wage for family members of the policyholder or the policyholder to complete that work. It can do up to $1,000, again, deductible, not going to apply. It's just it will pay up to $1,000. Here's what you should remember about those loss avoidance measures. There has to be a declaration that flooding is imminent. Declaration from your community officials, someone in official capacity has to make that declaration. If all of a sudden Sandy decides, you know what, there's a storm cloud out there, I live in Florida, I must surround my property with sandbags. If that declaration has not been met, then Sandy cannot collect that $1,000. That flood insurance policy is not going to pay, so that declaration has to be made. Another coverage in this section in Coverage C is property removed to safety. So the policy will pay up to $1,000 incurred to move the insured property to a place other than the insured location in order to protect it from flood damage. It has to be placed above ground level or outside of the special flood hazard area. So all of a sudden, if I decide, you know what, I want to keep some of my contents safe, I'm going to go ahead and put it on a pallet in my backyard because my backyard kind of has a hill. I'm not going to be able to collect that $1,000. Has to be placed above ground level or outside of that special flood hazard area. Have to keep that safe. So if that flooding is imminent, you want to keep your furs, your diamond jewelry, maybe your TV, move it to a friend's house who is in an X zone, put it in their upstairs guest room, things like that, just removed from safety. Again, up to $1,000 deductible on that, not going to be placed. Then we have one of my favorite coverages, which is Coverage D, and that is the increased cost of compliance. In the flood program, it's often referred to as ICC. This coverage, if the policyholder is eligible, can go up to $30,000 to do some very specific things, and they're listed on the screen, to flood-proof, to relocate, to elevate, or demolish. When I was learning flood, we called it FRED. So your ICC coverage is going to only cover those four things, and you can collect up to $30,000. But there's some qualifications for that. First is, look at the name, increased cost of compliance. We are talking about a structure that's not compliant that now has to be brought into compliance. So we're looking at structures that have suffered flood damage on 2 different occasions during a 10-year period, and the cost to repair that damage equals or exceeds 25% of the market value. The NFIP also has to have previously paid for those qualifying claims. And here's another qualification. The community has to have bylaws that really make some allowances in their floodplain management system for this particular process. So the community is going to be very involved. We're looking at structures who have already suffered damage. They're not in compliance. And so the NFIP is going to help defray the cost of either flood-proofing the structure, relocating the structure, maybe elevating the structure, or demolishing the structure. And it will pay up to $30,000. Remember, I kind of have been referring to that the NFIP will never pay higher than the program maximums. So on a single-family dwelling, let's say that I live in New Jersey, and after Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, I had to elevate my structure. So I have a $250,000 policy. I had $240,000 in building coverage. I can collect $10,000 to help defray the cost of elevating my structure. Why can't I have the $30,000? Because the NFIP will not pay higher than your program maximums. However, if I only used $200,000 of that coverage, limit is $250,000, then I can collect the entire $30,000. Now, in one of my presentations, I had an insured say, well, isn't that NFIP's way of making sure that we underinsure our structure so that your insured can collect the entire $30,000? Answer to that is equivocally no. And it's no because there has to be some qualifications in order to collect your increased cost of compliance. So not every structure is going to qualify for the increased cost of compliance. So no, do not underinsure your structure. And even at $30,000, is $30,000 going to pick up the entire bill for, let's say, elevating my home in New Jersey? No, but it's going to help get me on my way. Sandy, what's going on in our chat line?
Janet had a question, and she said, if insured sandbags and a flood occurred, would they be able to collect the avoidance money? My answer to that would be, and Heidi, correct me if I'm wrong, they would have to be able to have receipts. So, of course, they'd be able to collect, but they're going to have to be able to produce some sort of receipts where they purchased or had those sandbags filled, but they will need something to show they had an expenditure.
Yes, correct. Okay, now we've talked about our 4 different coverages. Let's also talk about some items that are just not going to be covered in that flood insurance policy. If you have personal property that's outside of a building, not going to be covered. In our photo, we have some lawn furniture that's outside on a patio, not part of the structure, not going to be covered in the flood insurance policy. A building and personal property in it located entirely on or over water or seaward mean high tide that is constructed or substantially improved after September 30th of 1982. Yes, indeed. Before 1982, the NFIP did offer some coverage for a structure that was completely over water. They found through some studies that that might not be the best plan of action. So if your structure is completely over water and it was built after 1982, the NFIP is not going to pay for that. Things such as boathouses, any structure that is, again, over water or a structure that the boat floats in, that's going to be covered. Any personal property that's in that structure, that's a boathouse, not going to be covered. Recreational vehicles, self-propelled vehicles, accounts, bills, coins, currencies, deed. Have you ever seen a box of bills that has been put in water? It kind of ends up to be one sticky mess. NFIP not going to pay for that. Again, NFIP likes function, doesn't necessarily like emotional value. Fences, retaining walls not covered. If you have hot tubs and spas that are not bathroom fixtures, swimming pools also not covered. Personal property owned in common with other units when in membership of a condominium. So if there is a condominium association, you live in a condominium, they have a clubhouse, the clubhouse would have to be covered under the RCBAP policy. It can't be covered under the individual policy. So if I had a treadmill that's in that gym that's commonly equipment, I can't cover that. Portions of walks, walkways, decks, driveways, patios that are outside of the perimeter. The NFIP not going to pay for a deck that is attached to the insured's property. The NFIP can only pay for about a 16-foot area to go into the structure and go out of the structure. Not going to pay for the deck, not going to pay for a gazebo. The NFIP also not going to cover the land that a structure sits on, no trees, no shrubs. Again, NFIP pays for function. NFIP not going to pay for pretty, things like that. I'm going to take just a little bit of break. Bob Butler did put in the chat a link to the generator details in the claims manual. So thanks to Bob Butler. Sandy, anything else that I didn't see that we didn't cover?
Yes, Kathy asked, would a deductible apply to the loss avoidance in your example? And I did respond to her in the chat, and I said the deductible does not apply to these limits, but it also does not increase the limits of liability under the policy.
The only time that the deductible is going to occur is your property removed to safety, and that's because you can go up to your entire building limit on that. But when you're talking about things that you can only collect up to $1,000, NFIP is not going to take deductible on those. Okay, moving forward, I promised that I would talk about when the NFIP looks at actual cash value and replacement cost, and really how that ties to our three different standard policy forms. So our dwelling form, again, is used for our residential structures for our 1 to 4 family. It has a replacement cost provision, which means that just because you have the dwelling form does not automatically mean that you're automatically going to recover replacement cost under the dwelling form. In order to recover replacement cost for that building coverage, has to be a single-family dwelling, has to be a principal resident, meaning that the insured lives in that structure for 80% of that policy term or more, and they purchase 80% of the replacement cost in coverage or the maximum available in the flood program. If those things are true, then the policyholder may recover replacement cost on that building coverage. But let's say that I live in a duplex and I only insured it up to 75%. That means that that building coverage is going to be settled actual cash value. The NFIP makes no guarantees that they're going to give replacement cost. The general property form, again, this is our form that does anything over 5, hotels, apartment buildings, commercial structures. It's really kind of our utilitarian property form. Only actual cash value on the building coverage. As long as it's in the general property form, replacement cost, not even a possibility. Contents coverage, again, always actual cash value. Our third form of our standard flood insurance policy, it's called the RCBAP, stands for the Residential Condominium Building Association policy. It's our condominium association's master policy. This is the only policy that has a coinsurance penalty. So the NFIP on that building coverage will repay replacement cost as long as the association has purchased 80% of the replacement cost or the maximum allowable in the flood program. If they've done that, then the NFIP will pay replacement cost. If the association does not cover 80% or the maximum allowable, then the NFIP is going to place a coinsurance penalty. Then they're going to take the deductibles, and whatever is left is going to be what the policyholders are going to recover on that. A couple of additional items when we're talking about actual cash value. Again, if you don't meet your single-family dwelling, live in at 80%, you have it insured up to 80% actual cash value. So if you're in a 2, 3, 4 family dwelling, actual cash value. If you live in a unit that's not 80% or more that you live in it, actual cash value. Detached garages, that's going to be settled actual cash value. Any contents coverage, settled actual cash value. If you have things that always undergo wear and tear, things like appliances, carpets, carpet pads, those are going to be settled in actual cash value. A couple of other things, outdoor awnings, outdoor antennas or aerials of any type, and other outdoor equipment, actual cash value. Any property covered under the policy that is abandoned after a loss and remains as debris, or a dwelling that's not a principal residence. Those are all things that are going to be actual cash value. So let's talk about appliances, carpet pads. Yes, they're part of that building, they're part of that structure. However, they're always undergoing wear and tear. We walk on them, we use them all the time. So the NFIP going to pay actual cash value on those particular items. There are some coverage limitations. At the very end of this presentation, I have a list that's kind of a little bit fuller than what we have on our slide. And you can find it in the NFIP manual as well. But if you have a structure that is a basement, it doesn't matter which flood zone you're in, it doesn't matter what zone that you're in, coverage limitations are going to apply. It will cover central air conditioners, it will cover drywalls for walls and ceilings, that's unfinished, unfloated, and not taped. It will cover the foundation, heat pumps, furnaces. These are things that are really essential for your particular structure. Things that aren't going to be covered are carpeting. If you have a finished bathroom in that basement, not going to be covered. If you have a TV, not going to be covered in that basement. Very similar limitations are going to apply if it is an elevated structure. So if it's elevated, it's in one of the higher risk flood zones, it's post-firm construction, same thing. It's the things that are really essential for that structure, the foundation, hot water heaters, heat pumps, furnaces. And again, in some of the behind slides, I have a complete list. There's also a list in the manual, but look for those basements, look for those elevated inside of that enclosure, because very limited coverage in those particular sections. So if we're talking contents in those same types of structures, there's only really 3 things that are going to be covered under that contents coverage. Air conditioning units. These are units that are set up, plugged in, and are working. So if I'm storing a bunch of air conditioning units in my basement, NFIP not going to pay for them, has to be set up, workable, and then it'll pay for that actual cash value. Clothes washers and dryers. So if I have my laundry set up in a basement, or if I have a walkout, that's considered elevated with an enclosure. If it's in a AE flood zone post-firm construction, the clothes washers and dryer are only going to be covered. If they choose not to have contents coverage, not going to be covered. The food freezer and the food in those freezers also covered, and that is it. Anything other than that, not going to be covered in that basement or in that enclosure. I have a couple more slides, then we're going to go ahead and finish out with some question and answers and some resources. So a couple of documents that I really suggest that you kind of take a look at, and maybe if we have time, Sandy can kind of paste in the links to those in the chat session. Or I can go ahead and send it at a follow-up email. But one is the summary of coverages. You can also access the summary of coverages from your flood processing website in the resources section. The summary of coverages is a document that the NFIP published really in order to take that really complicated policy and put it into some language that the NFIP really can help the insured understand what's going to be covered, what's not going to be covered. And this is all based on that standard flood insurance policy. This particular document really has not been revised, but that's because the policy has not been revised. So if you have an older copy, still going to be informational, still going to be acceptable. Highly suggest that. If the insureds have any question at all about what's covered in their policy, this is a much better document to read than having them go through all of the different languages of the flood policy. So that's one document I definitely suggest. Sandy, thank you for putting that in our chat line. Check that link out, very helpful. The other is the claims handbook, also a document that's prepared through the NFIP, and it's really designed to help the insured through the claims process. Step by step, it's going to outline what the policyholder should do before a loss, what they should do after a loss, and it's also going to address some questions about how that claims process works. Two very helpful documents. You can get them free from the NFIP. You can download them. When your policyholder has a brand new policy, they should be mailed those. Definitely highly suggest those two particular documents. So Sandy, I have you quite busy. I'm going to go ahead and have you launch our final survey. And I am going to then kind of talk about some of our resources. So as Sandy launches our final survey, I please ask you to go ahead and answer. There's all 3 questions. This is kind of surveying you to make sure that we really are helping give you the knowledge that you need. I know that it's sometimes really hard to get webinar sessions that will cover people who are just new to flood insurance and people who've been in flood insurance for a while, so we try to get that mix if at all possible. But it kind of helps us gauge where we're at. So if you'll take that survey, we would greatly appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and leave that up so that you can go ahead and work on that. A couple of resources that I would suggest you to go to. Sandy put some of the publications into the chat line, so check out your chat box. Bob Butler sent in a link for that generator question. That's going to be quite helpful. Also, FloodSmart. I haven't talked about FloodSmart yet. The NFIP has 2 websites. One is an agent-facing website. The other is really a consumer-facing website. Tons of information about flood insurance on those two particular websites. They continue to change it, update it. They have information about claims. They have information about coverages. If you're looking for marketing information, that's also going to be the place to go as well. NationalFloodServices.com, if you haven't checked out that website lately, I suggest that you do, because there is educational videos out there, there's marketing information out there, there's information about the flood program, things such as that. So tons of information there. So Sandy, any questions that we need to kind of work through in our chat line?
We do. Miranda had a question on a detached garage. Her question was, would a detached garage or barn have coverage under the dwelling or other structures? And by definition, Miranda, there is not actually other coverages, or I should say other structures coverages on any of the policies, with one exception. On the dwelling form, if there is a detached garage, and it has to be a detached garage only, not a barn, not a shed, nothing else, just a detached garage, by definition, that Heidi had mentioned before, you have to be able to, it has a door where a car can be driven through it. There's no attached mother-in-law suite or she shed or was a man cave, anything like that. It must just be used for parking, storage, or an entryway to a building. Then there could be 10% coverage extended from the dwelling form to the detached garage.